Okay, so hello everybody, and thank you so much for attending the Black History Speaker Series. So before I introduce you to our guests, let me introduce you to myself. My name is Michael Llamas. I'm the host for today's session with the Center for Global Partnership and Learning, and I'll be facilitating this session for everyone this afternoon. So a little bit about the center. The center provides GSCP students with a myriad of services ranging from publication support, certificate programs, access to GSEP's academic journals, and a few other services. So it's through the center that we bring you our programming to celebrate this Black History Month that are scheduled. So with that said, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Herbert Marbury. Dr. Herbert R. Marbury is an associate professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near East in the Divinity School at Vanderbilt University. He researches textuality, particularly how biblical texts come to meaning in the Black Atlantic. He holds a bachelor's of arts from Emory University, where he studied English literature and African American studies. And while serving as a pastor in the United Methodist Church, he completed his master's in divinity at Gammon Theological Seminary in the Interdenominational Theological Center. And he holds a PhD in religion from Vanderbilt University. He is the author of Imperial Dominion and Priestly Genius, Coercion, Accommodation, and Resistance in the Divorce Rhetoric of Ezra-Nehemiah. He investigates meaning of the text for ancient Israel facing Persian imperial oppression. In his recent works, Pillars of Clouds and Fire, The Political of Exodus and African American Biblical Interpretations, which won the Vanderbilt University Chancellor's Award, focuses on the ways contemporary communities deploy scriptures to construct counter-narratives to negotiate ongoing oppression. So with that, I'll pass it on over to Dr. Marbury, who will get us started.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Michael Llamas, for that very gracious introduction. I hope it wasn't too much, but I'm grateful to be here. I want to thank Charlotte Green for the invitation, and thank you all for coming to join me and celebrating this weekend, Black History Month. So let me begin by sharing a bit about myself and about our topic. I researched how the Bible comes to meaning in particular communities, in American communities, and I'm particularly interested in African American communities. And so, what I'll be talking about today is a branch of African American biblical interpretation. I'll talk about it in three moments: the antebellum or colonial moment, a first stage in African American biblical scholarship, and a stage of critique by African American feminist scholarship. And so let me begin with just a bit about myself. I grew up the son and grandson of Methodist ministers. And so for my family, church was more than what we did on Sundays. Our faith commitment was an integral part of the very fabric of our social world. We planned our days around meetings and around members. And my grandfather knew each family and each member by their names, by their stories, and by their struggle. And each Sunday, his task was to integrate their names, their stories, and their struggles with an uplifting word for people whose identity and self-worth were daily assaulted by economic oppression and the brutality of racism. He would tell them that the psalmist had them in mind and was writing to them with the affirmation that they were fearfully and wonderfully made. And on Sundays, when the community had some particularly devastating economic event or some racialized violence, he would begin by quoting the 68th Psalm, reading as prophetic that princes would come out of Egypt and that Ethiopia would soon stretch out her hands. And using Ethiopia and Egypt as a metaphor for Black peoples around the globe, Granddaddy would paint a grand picture of the rise of people of African descent, teaching about the great civilizations of Nubia and Axum, the centers of education in Timbuktu, and in us, he would exhort that God had created a people of great worth, and in the 68th Psalm, the Bible had already foretold it. That was my first encounter with African American biblical interpretation. It is a discourse of resistance set against the oppressive quality of Black existential life. So I'm going to say first, African American biblical interpretation is intentional. It consciously decides to stand on the side of freedom, and it tenaciously resists the evil of oppression. So, what does Black biblical interpretation have to do with our world today? And what, if anything, can we learn from it? Now, depending on whom you ask, African American biblical interpretation may date as early as the first time an American of African descent began to read the Bible for herself and raise questions about what she read and its connection to the dominant social, racial, political, and economic arrangements of her context. On a more formal, or in a more formal sense, it began as the first African Americans earned PhDs and THDs in biblical studies. I see a continuum that extends from those mothers and fathers of mother wit and good practical common sense all the way to those of us today. The connection between both groups, that is, the academic group and the non academic group, is that both take up the Bible to interpret meaning for their communities. Both raise questions such as what allows you to read passages from Paul that say, slaves, be obedient to your masters onto my body or onto my life? What allows you to claim Christianity, or however you claim the Bible in a particular faith tradition? What allows you to claim it and at the same time claim it in a way that treats one group of people as second class? That tradition of questioning has been passed on to us. In other words, at a theological level, the God of white evangelical Christianity, which began, and when I say white evangelical Christianity, I mean the major strand of Christianity that began here in North America, particularly in the United States, began as a way of justifying the enslavement of Africans. And so the God of white Christian, of that tradition, that strand of Christianity, Christian evangelicalism, the God of that strand cannot be the God of the oppressed. In other words, it cannot be our God. And so African American biblical interpretation interrogates that question. The God who enslaved us, that is, the God prayed to by early white Christian evangelicals, cannot be the God who also liberates us. And so, if you accept that premise, then I would submit that the biblical interpretations of evangelicalism, white evangelicalism, cannot be the biblical interpretations of the marginalized. So, African American biblical interpretation, consciously and to some degree implicitly, takes as its point of departure that the experiences of people of African descent can be a primary lens through which we interpret the text. So its second principle here is that African American biblical interpretation actively reads against injustice and affirms the humanity of the oppressed. So that might mean reading the Abraham and Sarah story with Hagar and then Sarah. It might mean reading the David and Bathsheba story with Bathsheba. If you read it, the story with Hagar and then Sarah, then one has to ask, where is God in the life of the enslaved woman Hagar? And how do we understand God as a people who were formerly enslaved? Do we want to read that text with the enslavers like Abraham and Sarah, or do we want to read it with the enslaved? Do we want to read the text with someone like David who understands Bathsheba's property, and because he owns the kingdom, everything in the kingdom is his property, and summons Bathsheba. She can't say no. Summons Bathsheba and takes advantage of her, and then mistreats her. So, and at the same, and beyond that, of course, you know the story. David goes ahead and and kills Bathsheba's husband as a way of masking what he did. But the point is, we normally read the story with David and then find a way to exonerate David, as opposed to reading the story with Bathsheba and attempting to hear her pain and hear and understand her plight as a person who had no choice. So, what I'd like to do today is talk about African American biblical interpretation over 3 successive historical moments. First, I want to turn to the colonial or antebellum moment. Much like the romantic historical lore that surrounds the American Wild West, in the antebellum or colonial moment, there really was no rule of law in terms of interpreting the text. Since African Americans were not a part of the Euro-American Academy, or not a part of, generally not a part of ecclesial bodies or church bodies, each person could interpret the text governed by the sensus communis, that is, the mores, the norms, and the values of his or her community. And for that brief moment, African American biblical interpretation was unabashed, it was radical, it was unfettered by orthodox notions of biblical authority, and in most cases, it was unaware of even then the sizable corpus of European and American biblical scholarship, whose ideas were used to support the continued enslavement and dehumanization of Africans in America. The fruits of such a bold hermeneutics, that is, a way of interpreting the text, routinely claim the authority to excise or to remove portions of the text that supported slavery or connected moral superiority to ethnic identity. Take, for example, this Howard Thurman, educator, preacher, civil rights and peace activist. He took an oral history from his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose. Nancy Ambrose had been born into slavery. And Ms. Ambrose told her grandson, Howard Thurman, that during the days of slavery, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. Always, the white minister used as his text something from Paul. Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters, as unto Christ. Then he would go on to show how if we were good and happy slaves, that God would bless us. And she says, I promise my maker that if I ever learned to read, and if freedom ever came, I would not read that part of the Bible. Now, Mrs. Ambrose's concerns were probably in response to hermeneutics or ways of interpretation, such as that of Charles Colcock Jones. He was a liberal, white Presbyterian, trained at Andover Seminary. And in the 10th annual report of the Association for the Religious Instruction of Negroes in Liberty County, Georgia, Jones reports this very curious but typical incident. He says, allow me to relate a fact which occurred in the spring of this year, illustrative of the character and knowledge of the Negroes at this time. I was preaching to a large congregation on the Epistle of Philemon, and when I insisted upon fidelity and obedience as Christian virtues, and upon the authority of Paul, I condemned the practice of running away. Well, one half of my audience deliberately walked off with themselves, and those that remained looked anything but satisfied, either with the preacher or his doctrine. After this mission, there was no small stir among them. Some solemnly declared that there was no such epistle in the Bible, others that it was not the gospel, and others that I preached to please masters, and others that they did not care if they never heard me preach again. That wonderful radicalism of the antebellum period was fueled by a belief in the Bible's ultimate advocacy of liberation over against the text as written, or the written word itself. After all, most African lay and clergy persons held as slaves had not been trained in Euro-American academies, and so they had not been trained to read the text in ways that vitiated their own humanity. Their faith resided in a God who unequivocally affirmed their humanity. So for them, authority resided not in the written text or in some doctrine of its inerrancy, but rather authority resided for them in another text. That is, the relationship between God and a people created in God's image. Now, beginning in the 20th century, African American biblical hermeneutics begins a long journey from plantations and churches to the religion academy. And with that shift comes an eclipse of freedom and the beginning of the ascendancy of the written word. Black clergy are now trained by predominantly white denominational traditions. No longer are they free to use unorthodox but culturally affirming methods to negotiate the biblical text. They must now contend with doctrines that were constructed in Euro-American institutional contexts like scriptural authority and inspiration, as conceived again, as I said, by Euro-American church traditions and institutional context. By 2000, well, let's go back just a bit. The first African American to earn a PhD in biblical studies was J. Leonard Farmer. That was back in 1918. Soon after 1921, we had the second, and by 2000, there were about 45 African Americans with PhDs in biblical studies. Now that that is a small number compared to the number of biblical scholars in the country, those who hold PhDs or THDs in biblical studies. That number is about 5,000. But let's move on to the mid 20th century when we begin to get this question of African American biblical interpretation proper. In 1947, Charles Buchanan Sopher, often referred to as the father of African American biblical interpretation, graduated from Boston University, and he became the 8th African American to earn the PhD in Old Testament studies. But it would be another 15 years until Sopher, inspired by the Black Power movement, and particularly the Black student protests of the 60s, would connect his scholarly work to an ideology that attempted to respond to the social reality of Black people. And this was then, in the 60s, the birth of African American biblical interpretation in a very formal sense. There are three ideological impetuses that undergird this. First, Black biblical interpretation intentionally reads against the corpus of traditional biblical interpretation, which it considers a tool of the ruling class. Second, Black biblical interpretation consciously tends to read against the dominant voice in the text, and I'll go further into that a little later in the talk. And third, it may read with the text, but it will read against the dominant paradigms of the context. That is, it'll read against the racist and otherwise biased cultural understandings of the context in which the reader lives. So let's begin with one of Charles Sopher's first insights. Now, we've all heard of the curse of Ham or the curse of Cain, right? Dr. Sopher noticed that much of the theological support for the negative stereotyping and subsequent dehumanization of African Americans rested on two notions: the curse of Ham, which Sopher terms the old Hamite view of the 16th or the 19th centuries, which stems from ancient rabbinical sources, and then the new Hamite view of the 19th and 20th centuries. Let's look at the old Hamite view, and I'll go back to ancient rabbinical sources. In the Midrash Rabbah, we find this passage. Rabbi Huna said in Rabbi Joseph's name that Noah declared, "You've prevented me from begetting a fourth son, therefore I curse your fourth son." And Rabbi Huna also said in Rabbi Joseph's name, "You've prevented me from doing something in the dark, therefore your seed will be ugly and dark-skinned." And Rabbi Chia said, "Ham and the dog copulated in the ark, therefore Ham came forth black-skinned, while the dog publicly exposes his copulation." Now, attached to this was the curse of Cain, which Dr. Sopher traced as far back as English literature of the 12th century. Again, the Midrash is illustrative. In the Midrash Rabbah of Genesis 22, we read this phrase, this passage, "And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. and he became like a firebrand. That is, Cain was blackened. Throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Euro-American thought and theology around the enslavement of people of African descent was supported, was supported, supported the view, rather, that because their origins were divinely cursed, that is, because God had cursed Ham and God had cursed Cain, and again, this goes to their interpretations of the Bible. Because God had cursed Ham and God had cursed Cain, that people of African descent were also cursed, and their social position should be subordinate to those of European descent. Although the belief that Cain was the ancestor of people of African descent was common among Euro-Americans, it was the Mormons who made it into a basic doctrine. In fact, it wasn't until the mid 20th century, before late 20th century actually, before Mormons allowed African Americans to be clergy, and it wasn't until the late 20th century that Mormons repudiated the doctrine that people of African descent went to a different afterlife. So Sopher's work, that is, first generation African American biblical hermeneutics, deconstructed the corpus of racist biblical scholarship that he believed undergirded the position, the position of African Americans in society, that is, African American oppression. In doing so, he saw himself as participating in the Black revolutionary spirit of the 1960s, which interrogated any authority structure that supported the repression of Black life and culture. Sopher would also take on the new Hamite view, which arose out of the junction between the early 20th century biblical scholarship and biblical archaeology, which attempted to obliterate the presence of African in the Old Testament by arguing that although African nations are mentioned in the Bible, these names do not refer to Black people at all. Contrary to the old Hamite view, this view was based on the idea that people of African descent had contributed nothing to the rise of human civilization, and certainly would not have been present in the Bible. Reading against the grain of biblical interpretation, Sopher exposed the schizophrenia with regard to Africans. That is, if they are present, they must be enslaved or cursed, such as Ham and Cain. And if they are not cursed, if the people are not cursed in the Bible, then they must not be of African descent. In response to this new Hamite view, Sopher noticed that, second to Jerusalem, Egypt is the location mentioned most in the Old Testament. Yet scholars have ignored this North African country's influence on the production of the Bible and the creation of Israelite culture. Sopher's analysis is of the first type. He reads against the body of scholarship, of scholarly interpretation. He attempts to thwart the ideology of the dominant body of scholarship by demonstrating that the very people whom scholars have ignored, namely Black people, are the main characters of the text. One of his more provocative arguments concerns the racial designation of Moses. With tongue-in-cheek, Sopher plays mischievously on the one-drop designation of Blackness that has shaped historical understandings of race in the United States. He begins first by noting that Moses is an Egyptian name, much like Ramesses, Tutmosis, Ahmoses. And second, Moses' family is replete with people with African names, such as Aaron or Hophni or Merari, and his sister Miriam and Phineas, which means Nubian. Further, he was identified as an Egyptian by the daughters of Jethro in Exodus 2, verse 19. And Moses' wife was a Cushite who introduced him to the rite or the ritual of circumcision, which is a patently North African practice. And finally, Sopher appeals to Greco-Roman descriptions of the most ancient Egyptians, which attest to their physical Blackness. So Sopher uses the etymology or the study of the origins of names and cultural practices to identify Moses as an Egyptian. Sopher's first generation type reads against previous interpretations of the Bible and argues that Anglo-American scholars have intentionally read people of African descent out of the text. Most of his arguments continue to hold sway today in biblical scholarship, and his work has raised the esteem of African Americans. With a thorough, painstaking scholarship, Cofer's work found African Americans in the Bible and brought to light the historical relationship between African American people and the God of our American acquired faith. Let's move now to a second generation. With major differences in methodology, but only minor differences in philosophical perspective, Randall Bailey represents a second generation of Black biblical scholarship. Bailey is interested in moving beyond the identification of African people in the text. He wants to analyze how African nations function in the text.
Oh, Dr. Marbury, I think you went off mute. Oh, there you go.
Hello? Am I
Yeah,
here?
we can.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear.
All right. Where was it? I'm sorry. Bailey is interested in moving beyond the identification of African people in the text. He wants to analyze how African people and nations function in the text. The nuance here is that Randall Bailey understands that Abraham, Moses, and so forth function literarily. That is, they are traditions that arise out of the life and culture of ancient history. They're not, ancient Israel. They are not necessarily historical. So his approach is based on how the writer imagines them in the literature, rather than how they may have existed in history if they are historical characters. He looks at the function of African people in several types of biblical literature. Let me consider two: biblical poetry and biblical narrative. While the Old Testament prophets disagreed on much in terms of theology, there's one thing that they could probably agree on. That is the prominence of Egypt as a cultural image in the minds of the Hebrew people, and they believed that was problematic. Egypt, until the 6th century BCE, was the dominant political and economic power in the ancient world. So the prophets Hosea, Isaiah, and Jeremiah struggled against the people's high estimation of Egypt. They attempted to convince Israel that their God, Yahweh, was more powerful than even the Egyptians. So the question here becomes, what might that tell us about the valuation of Egypt in the minds of the ancient Hebrews? What might this say about the people with whom the prophet Isaiah would plead? Now the Egyptians are men and not God. The text is clear that Egypt is a negative icon, and those who trust in her might or her political stature and wisdom are doomed. Bailey, however, using an ideological critique, looks for what the text is not saying. That is, what is it about Egypt that has captivated the people's minds so much that they look to Egypt for strength? They look to Egypt for wisdom and for protection. He asks, why would the prophets rail against? Why would they inveigh against? Why would they argue so vehemently against their neighbor to the south? Beyond strength, it's interesting the way that African nations are considered as a standard for wealth. For example, now these statements appear in simile or metaphor as a way of contrasting, but notice here Ezekiel 27, verse 7, fine linen with embroidered work from Egypt, which was that which thou spreadest forth to be thy sail. Blue and purple from the isles of Elisha was that which covered thee. Or Isaiah 45. Thus says the Lord, the labor of Egypt, the merchandise of Ethiopia and of the Sabians, men of stature shall come over unto thee, and they shall be thine, and they shall come after thee in chains. They shall come over, and they shall fall down unto thee, and they shall make supplication unto thee, saying, surely God is in thee, and there is none else, there is no God. And finally, in Job 28, the topaz of Ethiopia shall not equal it, neither shall it be valued with pure gold. In each, the metaphor only works if that which is considered valuable and and also, of course, connected to either Egypt or Ethiopia. That commodity, whether it's the linen in Ezekiel, or whether it is the merchandise of Ethiopia, or whether it is the topaz of Ethiopia, that it must be extraordinarily valuable for God to use it as a standard of wealth. So in other words, it wouldn't work for the writer to use something that was not valuable. The metaphor would not make sense. So So he argues here that African nations are used as a standard of wealth, and in as much as they're also used as a standard of protection. So when you read fine linen, think mink or chinchilla. In Egypt and in Ethiopia, African nations were used as the standard of valuation. The intent of the rhetoric is to illustrate the power of God in appropriating wealth. In other words, the prophets are saying, look, these are the things that I shall give to you. What more effective way than to use as an example the wealthiest nations known to the people in ancient Israel at that time? In other words, it's only when they believe that Yahweh controls even Egypt's wealth that indeed Yahweh must be powerful. In each passage, Bailey reads against the dominant voice of the text. Let's see here. Look at the Hosea 7 text. Ephraim is also like a silly dove without heart. They call to Egypt. They go to Assyria. Ephraim is a reference to northern Israel, and the point here is that the prophet is inveighing against northern Israel, saying, "Don't go down to Egypt for protection." But if they're going down to Egypt for protection, it must say something about the stature of Egypt in the minds of the writers. In the Isaiah 30 passage, Egypt again is used as a standard of power. Woe to the rebellious children, saith the Lord, that take counsel, but not of me, and that cover with a covering, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin. They walk to go down to Egypt, and I have not asked at my mouth to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and trust in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore shall the strength of Pharaoh be your shame, and the trust in the shadow of Egypt your confusion. So Egypt is used as a standard of power. We saw it in Ezekiel 27, the last slide. Egypt is used as a standard of wealth there, and in Isaiah 45 as well. Bailey's rationale is that it would not make sense for the writer to use a nation that had nothing, a nation that was weak, or one that the people did not esteem as the standard of Yahweh's power. Let me turn now to a third strand in African American biblical interpretation. Renita Weems moves from reading text to reading the way readers read text, namely African American women. She also reads against the dominant voice of the text, but she particularly looks to lift up the voice of African American women in reading and faith communities and reading communities. I want to look at Genesis 16, and I'll summarize that very quickly. We find the story of Abraham, who has just been promised that he would become a father to a nation too numerous to count. In other words, he's going to have children at the ripe old age of 100. Now, as you know, in the ancient world, women were generally considered property. They generally could not own land or hold a job. They needed to be attached to, by way of ownership, that is, attached to their father and subsequently their husband. That is, they were part of the father's household. They were owned by their fathers until their fathers, generally for a bride price, would give, if you will, the daughter as property to a husband. And at that point, she becomes the husband's property. Their value was in their ability to produce children, particularly male children. If you notice as you read the Old Testament in particular, the ideal is a male child. There are no stories of daughters being born. The stories are all about boys being born. At a time when male children were valued for their ability to offer protection to the family in a nomadic society and agricultural production, in a in in an agrarian society, sons were important. They were important for protection. They were also important for agricultural production. So when Abraham comes home and says, I'm going to become a father, and he's 100, Sarah's 90, Sarah's in a difficult position. She lives in a culture where she knows that her value is determined by her ability to produce male children. If she cannot fulfill that obligation, then she may lose her status and maybe her husband and maybe even her life. That is, she might be put out and to be divorced, or to be a woman in the ancient world who is not attached to a man, that is a brother, a father, or a husband, is almost certain death. Um, what if Abraham takes on another wife and she's demoted to a second wife? Or what if he, according to the law of Moses, writes her a bill of divorce and sends her on her way? As a woman, she could not have survived without the protection of a husband, a brother, or a father. So she does the only thing that she knows to do. She turns on her enslaved girl, Hagar, and offers her up to Abraham as a way of protecting her own position. In other words, she does have power over Hagar. And so she offers Hagar up, and Hagar suffers the sexual assault so that Sarah's place in the household is preserved. Now, Renita Weems, and I think rightly so, reads Hagar's story as the story of so many of our mothers in the antebellum South, mothers of people of African descent in the antebellum South, whose bodies and souls were offered up to the lustful and destructive desires of white slave masters, sacrificed to the demigods of racism and the structural power of white supremacy. The writer gives her no voice. We never hear from Hagar in that scene. Sarah is pressed by her own tenuous position, and Abraham is just as satisfied as he wants to be to take this young slave girl. In the end, Hagar is the victim, and Sarah is in no better position. When Sarah feels threatened by what she perceives as Hagar's new status, she employs the privilege of her ethnicity and casts her out alone and pregnant. She does to Hagar exactly what she feared Abraham would do to her. By reading the text with Hagar and not with Abraham, Renita Weems gives voice and visibility to a segment of the locked out, the last, and the least of our society. She calls Black women to raise their voices by claiming their own historical experience and laying it as, as a valid interpretation alongside that of more traditional interpretations that attempt to silence Black women and render moot the experiences of those who are oppressed. Weems also raises in Hagar the painful betrayals that many Black women have experienced at the hands of their white counterparts. So the question for us is, where and when do we enter into the future of this discourse? I invite you to bring your own questions that arise from your own cultural context. I invite you to take ownership of the ways that you read your own sacred text, whether it's the Bible or other sacred texts. While the historical conditions that birth African American biblical interpretation have certainly been mitigated by social and political struggle, the philosophical and spiritual impetus for resisting oppression in whatever form we find it calls all of us, those of us who are lay, clergy, and academic, non-academic circles, to engage the biblical text with all of our analytical tools, all of our human sensibilities, so that we might give voice to the marginalized and reclaim as human those who have been demonized by our readings of the very text that our tradition gives to us as the Word of God. And when we all do so, we can work together to ensure that all of us will have a right, not only to the tree of life, but all of us will have a voice in the discourse in the ways that we are represented in our faith traditions, and all of us will be able to recognize and appreciate our different humanities in ways that call us to a place of equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marbury. That was that was very insightful and educational too. Um, does anybody have any questions for Dr. Marbury at this time? You guys can unmute yourselves, or you can ask the questions in the chat and I can read them. Well, while I was listening to your presentation, Dr. Marbury, one of the questions that did come to mind was how can we as educators or students in this, like how can we get more educational, more individuals to get them interested in how uh like how to read it or how to interpret the writings.
I think it's important for, first of all, for each of us to claim our own cultural context, our own backgrounds, because we're all very different. And to understand that my cultural context, my cultural background, my cultural identity is just as valid as anyone else's. And so is my faith tradition, just as valid as anyone else's. And so it's African American biblical interpreters begin by placing African American experience at the center of our interpretive work. I would hope that other groups would do the same, to begin to claim your own experience at the center of your way of reading whatever sacred text you might read, whether it's the Bible or other sacred texts. Uh, as ultimately, our sacred traditions, our faith traditions, ought affirm our humanity.
Very good, very good. Jenny wrote here in the chat that she wants to thank you for the lecture, that it was also insightful for herself as well.
Thank you, thank you. I again, I appreciate the invitation, and I'm glad that I was able to share, and I appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to listen for a few minutes, well, for almost an hour. So I thank you,
It was a
each of
great
you.
presentation, Dr. Marbury. Really appreciated it. Does anybody have any questions?
Actually, I have a question.
Yes, go
I'd
ahead.
like to know um, what are your own what are your faith traditions, the faith traditions in this virtual room, and um, do your faith traditions affirm your experience? I would suspect in any academic setting, we'd have several faith traditions and several cultural traditions.
Well, speaking for myself, I grew up in a like a traditional Mexican household, I guess you can say. I was brought up Catholic, and you know, my mother was always the one in the religious and more religious than my father, and we would also attend church. Now, when she would read us the Bible, we would and go to church. I feel like that is what really set me to just be on a course, right? From the
Hmm.
different types of other children that I grew up with.
Hmm.
And I kind of felt like that's what brought me to even this school, the Pepperdine University school that I came to, because I did the public school, and I felt that, I don't know, like I just felt that I needed a religious path, right? Like I just needed to go one way to that. But that's kind of how from my culture and from how I see things. I'm not sure if anybody has anything that they want to share with that. Again, you guys can unmute yourselves, or if you want to write in the chat, it's
Any any other faith traditions besides uh, besides Christianity, or is everybody here um, a part of the same faith tradition?
Well, I didn't grow up as solely Christianity based.
Mhm.
I grew up in a household where many different types of religions were kind of practiced and
Mhm.
accepted. So it was kind of like up to me what religion I choose. So I
Okay.
think that Christianity just kind of like, I guess, spoke to me more
Okay.
spiritually. So I think that's why I gravitated towards it. So that's just my perspective on
Okay.
the
All right.
religion.
All right. And as you've practiced Christianity, you feel like you've been culturally affirmed and you've been affirmed in terms of your own humanity, or do you feel like in some ways the way Christianity is practiced in the United States marginalizes you?
I think it's a little bit of both. Maybe right now that I'm getting a little bit more insight on the Christian faith,
Mhm.
being at Pepperdine, I'm more engaged with certain types of religious groups, and I'm not um, engaged with other types of groups. So it's kind of like I'm still getting perspective and I'm still growing. So, but I am enjoying like what I am learning and experiencing and knowing.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, continue to learn and grow. I hope that you will always, as you learn and grow, you will always remain faithful to the voice inside of you, and that affirms you as a child of God, and values your humanity. Any other brave souls? No other brave souls. Okay. Well, again, I thank you for the opportunity to come and to share, and I hope that the lecture was insightful. And I want to thank again Charlotte Green for the invitation, and I wish you well as you continue your studies at Pepperdine.
Thank you, Dr. Marbury. The book that you wrote, where can we purchase that, or where can we look that up?
At Amazon.com.
Amazon.com. Okay.
Yes, yes. Or you can go directly to New York University Press, either one. But it's on Amazon.com.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
The title is Pillars of Cloud and Fire.
I posted
Okay.
the title right in the chat so everybody can see.
Okay. Great. Great. And it chronicles the history of African American interpretation of the Book of Exodus, beginning in the antebellum period, just before the Civil War, and going through Reconstruction, the era of the Harlem Renaissance and the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power movements, all the way up to the present day.
You know, one of the when you were talking about Dr. Bailey, one of the things that stood out to me,
Mhm.
because when I was attending community college, I was really into history.
Mhm.
And the passages you talked about, Ezekiel 27, where it talked about the embroidery, the
Mhm.
blue and the purple,
Yes.
um, the Phoenicians, I can't remember the period, but the Phoenicians, they were in part of northern Africa. They would take
Yes.
the colors of the sea snails and they would make a tyrant color called tyrant purple.
Mhm.
So whenever they would go into battle, other nations never wanted to attack them because other nations didn't know where to get that color, and it was also called like a royal purple. And I just thought that was fascinating when you brought that up. I
Yeah.
was like, wow, you know.
Yes. Yes. And purple was hard to produce in the
Hmm.
ancient world, so it was very valuable. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not like it is today. So I take for granted my purple shirt and my purple tie.
Okay, great. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, if does anybody have any other questions? If not, we can wrap this up.
All right. Well, thank you all again, and thank you, Michael.
Of course, Dr. Marbury. Thank you
All
so
right.
much for sharing. We really
All
appreciate
right.
it.